So we continue this conversation about the military action we've seen from this White House, first in Syria in response to the chemical attack there, now in Afghanistan, where at least 36 ISIS fighters were told are dead from this U.S. bomb, the mother of all bombs, as it's called. Our next guest, looking back at history. 31 years ago today, the United States then bombed Libya in retaliation for terrorism against U.S. troops. The presidential historian Doug Wead is with us to talk a little bit about President Reagan acting quickly, Doug, in the face of conflict. And are you seeing parallels 31 years ago today with what President Trump is dealing with in 2017?
Connell, it's uncanny. I mean, both men have come into office with guns blazing, and they both have inherited a climate of appeasement and fear. You mentioned Gaddafi as a good example, but you couldn't even call the enemy the enemy. In Reagan's time, he gave a speech you'll remember calling the evil empire, and the left was hysterical. They said, you're going to cause more trouble, just as today you can't call Islamic terrorists or you'll create more terrorists. So it's uncanny. You have on campus professors embracing fundamentalist Islam. They're throwing gays off rooftops in the Middle East. They're practicing genocide on Christians. Rape victims are being executed because in their culture the rape victim is the cause of the crime. You have all of this occurring, similar atmosphere to what happened with Reagan.
The comparison between the two presidents. I think President Trump would be open to and quite welcoming of a comparison to President Reagan, certainly. Some of his detractors, though, have said that there are differences. I've seen articles written as just an example of saying one of the keys to President Reagan's success is he knew what he didn't know, and he was able to delegate very well, whereas this president has been criticized for not being so adept at knowing what he doesn't know. What do you think?
Oh, yeah, they're not exactly the same. There's no doubt about it. But the atmospherics are very similar. And he's being, I believe he's underestimated like Reagan was.
Right.
And the climate, the national media in opposition to him, and academia in opposition to him. I think it was worse under Reagan. We had 1 million people marching in the streets of New York City when Reagan introduced intermediate nuclear missiles in Western Europe, all of Western Europe. The campuses were just going crazy. His approval ratings lower even than Donald Trump. So it could get worse before it gets better.
Now, the issue of the military is one thing, and we made the comparison to Libya in 1986. But the other thing that happened back then was that tax reform got done, right? I mean, that is also has to be at least something of a parallel conversation to the one we're having now. And we're worried from people we're talking to that maybe that is going to be more challenging this time around. But it was pretty challenging back then, too, wasn't it?
It could be, but Donald Trump has inherited two extremely difficult crises with North Korea and with Iran that have been passed on to him that he has to handle. If he can handle them the way Reagan handled the Cold War, which nobody believed was even possible, that ushered in the greatest economic growth period in American history.
Right.
It covered uninterrupted 3 presidencies. Well, 1 interruption under George H.W. Bush, but a marvelous economic recovery. So if he can deal with some of these issues.
Well, what didn't President Reagan, though, specifically on taxes, do a pretty good job of working with, say, Speaker Tip O'Neill and the like? And will this president be able to do something similar? I mean, it's hard to imagine right now, but maybe it was hard to imagine then, too, for some time.
Yes, you're right. We're looking back on it with the full 8 years in mind. And remember, the first 100 days of Ronald Reagan, he was shot. The only thing he signed in his pajamas in a hospital bed was dairy supports, ending dairy supports. So we got to give Donald Trump a little bit of time to make these things happen. He's actually out of the gate pretty quickly on many of these issues. So there's a lot of hope still for Donald Trump, and I think the stock market reflects that.
It does. I mean, it's up, I believe, the Dow 3.5% or a little bit more than that percent since Inauguration Day, and far more since the election. So, Doug Wead, thank you very much, sir. He's the author of a new book. It's called Game of Thorns, Doug is, all about the election in 2016. So we can relive all of that, and boy, there's plenty to relive. Thank you, sir.